So the paper sun phenomenon is a direct and tangible and bitter byproduct of the Chinese Exclusion Act. To some optimists, it may seem to be a triumph of human ingenuity and a determination over unabashed racism, but really to the people who lived through it, it was more typically a story of fear, heartbreak, and humiliation, and a source of abiding distrust of all American officialdom. Paper suns were greatly facilitated by the 1906 earthquake and resulting fires, which destroyed a lot of the local public records. And as a result, Chinese residents of San Francisco were able to claim that they were born in San Francisco and therefore native-born United States citizens. As such, their offspring were automatically citizens of the United States. And these newly minted citizens could then bring their offspring from China into the United States, usually sons, to join them. And in addition to that, they would take trips to China, and when they would return, they'd report the birth of another offspring or so, and therefore create so-called slots for additional people to come to the United States as citizens. And these fictional children were known as paper sons and paper daughters, and I'm sure all of the Chinese that are in this audience are very familiar with that. Although persons of my generation were really not all that keyed into what was going on, although we knew something was happening. Following its opening in 1910, the Angel Island Immigration Station became the chief barrier to the admission of these Chinese seeking to enter the United States as citizens. It was a bleak detainment center with a unique set of grueling and aggressive and cunning interrogation techniques, not designed to determine who would make a good citizen in the United States, but to ferret out who was actually related to an American citizen. The paper sons and daughters, in turn, would, with typical Asian work ethic, prepare meticulously and painstakingly to memorize every detail of their putative families, sometimes supplied with 200-page coaching books for that purpose. Now, who lives in the third house in the second row of houses in your village? And how many steps are there to your house in that village? Wrong answers to those type of questions could lead to lengthy detention in Angel Island, and ultimately could lead to your deportation back to China, or return to China, forced return to China. And although 97% of the Chinese, of the 175,000 Chinese who came to the Angel Island Immigration Station were eventually able to enter the United States between 1910 and 1940, when the station was finally closed, the process was undoubtedly painful, degrading, and demoralizing, and left a lasting negative impression on these people. And you can see the pain in some of the poetry that the detainees wrote in their barracks as they waited to see what would happen to them. The paper sun phenomena also created a lot of confusing and tangled family trees in the Chinese community, and consequently a lot of us, including myself, grew up knowing that somehow Uncle Wallace was not really my dad's brother, but that's how he was portrayed to the outside world, and we weren't supposed to talk about it. And in fact, I remember I'm talking about my Uncle Wallace, who died many years ago, and I never did ask, how is he really related? Because we weren't encouraged to do that. And many Chinese families used their real surnames in the Chinese community, and then they used their fictional names for all official purposes. The paper sons were also inviting targets at times of extortionists and persons who wanted to exploit their fear, and many felt constrained to live on the outskirts of society. The practice ended for the most part with the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1943, but the practice came back to further haunt and demoralize the Chinese community in the early 1957, when the Immigration and Naturalization Service announced the so-called Chinese Confession Program. This is where Chinese paper sons were invited to confess their original false entries to the United States in exchange for possible lawful resident status at the discretion of the INS. Note, however, that the confessors were required to relinquish their American citizenship status with no guarantee that they would ultimately not be criminally prosecuted and then deported back to China. And they were required to provide a complete, comprehensive history of their false entries into the United States, naming names of all persons who were involved. So, of course, this had a potentially huge ripple effect, as one confessor could implicate his or her entire extended family by confessing. Now, some observers saw this Chinese confession program as just another facet of the 1950s anti-communist hysteria. Others in the Chinese community weren't impressed or persuaded by the announced rationale of the humanitarian purpose of the program was to free these otherwise law-abiding citizens from their stain of their original false entries, and to allow them to assume their true identities and names. And prominent Chinese leaders such as Lin P. Li considered the program as just another thinly disguised attack on the Chinese community and an instance of selective prosecution, particularly against the backdrop of the racist exclusionary acts, and therefore encouraged the people in the Chinese community to not participate in the program, somewhat successfully. And all in all, it's estimated that by 1965, roughly 30,000 persons participated in the Chinese confession program, about 11,000 who voluntarily came in to confess, and about 19,000 others who were kind of swept up in the process and were involuntarily involved in the program. So I know that all the members of the panel here, with Chinese heritage, have some very personal and compelling ways to share with you that
Mike,
this touched.